Learning culture is so important, and teaching people to learn something new, anything, to just keep taking in information is important. But I'm not immune to wanting to make sure that my learners understand that I know they don't have that much time. They want to be clear on, like, well, what do I need to learn to be great in this role or in this task or at this point in the business cycle, and that business leaders are concerned about the business outcome. So holding both in two hands, but not ever letting go of the learning culture piece, because I think that if you lose sight of just helping people think of themselves as learners, it's so much more difficult to do the rest of the work, and you're doing your learners a disservice, because at some point they have to just continue learning at the speed at which change is happening, which is getting faster and faster than our ability to create specific programs about specific topics or functions or whatever you want to call them.
Hi, Pamay.
Hey, Vince.
Really great to have you today. It's been really good to get to meet you and know you and hear about your incredible journey in the learning world as an executive now. So thanks for joining to share your insights.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, I want to first start by just asking you, how did you get into corporate learning as a field?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it was not a straight line. I started out in technology. I studied AI at Stanford back when we were still talking about rule-based systems and that sort of thing. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to create intelligent computers. And when I realized, when I went through my, program of study and determined, like, well, what am I going to do next? I'm graduating from undergrad. I found a program at Northwestern that was run by AI researchers, by the late Dr. Roger Schenck. And his whole perspective was, well, we can take the knowledge that we have about how the mind works and how people learn and create better learning environments. And it was sponsored by Accenture. And thus my entry into corporate learning came kind of through the side doors, really trying to find practical application for the AI research that I had been exposed to, and continued down the consulting path until I entered into kind of an HR department where I was director of learning and then chief learning officer. So my path to learning was through tech.
And how did you transition from tech into HR and people function?
Yeah, I mean, I thought initially of myself as a software designer, right? I was a learning designer. I was a UI designer. I was creating educational software. But after my time at Accenture, I started my own company and my own shop. And at that point, I became agnostic about the delivery mechanism, where I was more of a technology and ed tech purist. I started saying, you know what, if it's face-to-face learning, if I'm a facilitator, if I'm at the front of the room, that's fine generally, because I had to find different ways to generate revenue. And that was the bridge to more of a corporate learning experience, where sometimes you have face-to-face learning and sometimes you have technology-enabled learning, and that was okay with me. So that was the transition back into frankly, HR.
Cool. Well, what's really interesting, I think, about your story is that you came from like a tech background going into L&D, which is not common. I would say I would love to hear what has been most surprising about making this transition, and what have you learned about either humans or how organization functions as you transitioned to this field?
Yeah. I mean, I'm lucky because I have kind of a community of folks who kind of have taken the same path, and we've been able to see each other work through, whether it's in corporate or university settings, kind of the mindset of using technology where it makes most sense. What was most surprising for me is that there's still, and throughout my career, has been this, this ongoing narrative around how face-to-face learning is better than technology-enabled learning, that somehow you cannot have effective learning. Not everybody says this, but many people still feel like learning means you fly somewhere, you sit in a room, there's someone in the front of the room, you're in the same room as your peers, and that's how you learn. And I never had that feeling, right? I think good learning is good learning. I think you can use technology to create great learning. You can use technology to create really bad e-learning. It's more about the learning design. It's more about your approach of keeping the learner at the center. So it was surprising to me, given my entry into this field, how some people really feel like you can't have great learning using technology as the medium or the mechanism.
Yeah, that's really interesting that because you're coming from the field of technology, you have a different vantage point instead of assumptions, and you're able to
Right.
sort of challenge what people typically take as the truth, right, in the field.
Yeah, and
Um,
I will say, I mean, also, I was able to learn from some folks about how sometimes it is better to be in the same room, depending on who the audience is or what the topic is or what learning outcomes, whether it is, creating community or it is, leaders in a cohort based situation. There are some times where it's nicer to be in the same room, but I don't think one is inherently better than the other.
mm, yeah, and especially for you, you're thinking about learning at a massive organization, right? It's not like a small startup or a mid-sized company we're talking about. And so technology-enabled learning is quite necessary to be able to deliver what you need to do. I'm curious if you have any insights or takeaways about what it takes to deliver learning at a really large scale and where technology has helped.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to keep the learner at the center, right? When you have situations where people are either not learning what they are supposed to, or they're bored to tears because what you're providing is not relevant to their day to day, it's even more important to ask the question like, what are we really trying to accomplish when you have a very large organization? Because it's very easy for someone to say, for example, we need people to learn this skill, communication skills, and you just say, well, here's some solutions, but if they're not relevant to that person, to their function, to the challenge they're trying to have, etc., then it doesn't land. And so I think the challenge of delivering learning at scale is it needs to be so relevant to that end learner, in a way that now frankly technology is helping us to do this kind of mass personalization, but for a long time it was you kind of just had to ask lots of questions so you could make sure that the people who you were trying to provide quality learning to were actually getting what they needed and not just getting kind of commentary about the topic that is was on the table.
Yeah. Um, and of course, like one of the, I think I definitely see a lot of potential for technology to help learners access the right sort of content or information as they need. But there's also just constant criticism of content is not the answer. Like people thinking content does not mean people are learning, especially when it comes to skills or things that are just more complex to do, right? I'm curious, and of course that's harder to do at scale. I'm curious for you how you think about like deeper sort of learning and how you balance things with technology.
Yeah, I definitely don't think content is necessarily the answer, and
Mm,
there's always very interesting conversations about whether we're delivering content or we are trying to create learning experiences.
mm,
I come from custom simulation, so imagine putting your learner giving them a role and a goal and some
mm,
resources and putting them in an environment where they have to learn by doing. And when I was working on 40-hour simulations to teach financial concepts or to teach people how or legal documentation, etc. Uh, it's too long. It's too intensive from a resource perspective to design, develop, deliver. But the relevant piece is still the same. That is, what do I want you to know and be able to do? How can I make the learning as close to what you have to go back to your desk and do? And I think if you continue to think about that, then it's not that hard to understand why delivering content is not what you're trying to accomplish. You really want people to have the opportunity to learn how to do something, and whether you call it a skill or a task in some of the nomenclature of today, what do I want you to be able to do? What behavior do I want you to be able to exhibit after you've been through this learning experience? And I think that is the differentiation between me just taking a course and clicking on a button until it's over and me being able to say, I need to go back to my desk and do this differently, whether it's with different resources or different processes or a different mindset. I think that's the difference between content delivery
yeah.
and actually learning.
Actually, I love the way you put that. Uh, which is like, is it how close is it to what you're gonna have to actually do? And sometimes learning is just about making you recall certain information quickly so you can, so in that world, I think presenting content may be just totally fine. And maybe you just need to do it in like a small bite-sized way, because all you need to be able to do is people can recall the right information when they are speaking or something. But as soon as it becomes something that's a lot more applied, where you have to, it's actually not about the principles, it's the translation of the principles, like whether it be how you communicate or how you solve problems or things that are just, you know, a little bit more applied. At now, just like reading principles doesn't work. Like the same way you can't learn how to, you know, ride a bike just by reading about how to ride a bike. You got to actually sort of do the thing.
Yeah. I think in corporate spaces, so often it is about the application. And some of the feedback we get that's not so positive is, hey, this was not, oh, I forgot. I took the course, it was great. The people were great. And then I went back to my desk and I forgot all the things that you taught me because I wasn't actually applying them in any sort of way. And constantly getting the feedback, can we make it more applicable? Can we make it look more like work? And frankly, having then to look at it at, kind of in a more multidimensional way, which is, it's not just about you coming to take a course. What tools and systems are you faced with when you get back to your desk, and how can we make sure that they align, right? If you come to my class and I teach you how to chop down a tree with an axe, and then you get back to your desk and you've got a nail file, well, you're going to forget very quickly about that great experience you had in the forest, and you're going to say, how the heck am I going to use this nail file? And so I think it's really important for learning teams to be clear on what the business is going through, how things are done, and then try to bridge that gap for learners so they don't have to do it themselves.
Yeah, I like that. Of course, now let's maybe dive into how you are actually experimenting with technology today. Can you give me a sense for, Kraft Heinz and other places where you've delivered sort of learning programs? What are some of the major technological innovations you've rolled out?
Yeah. So I talked about simulations. That's something that I did earlier in my career and into my time at BlackRock. A lot of e-learning there, also at BlackRock, creating academies based on, whether it's investment or technology or sales or whatever the function is. At Kraft Heinz, at this point, we're actually also taking the role of trying to upskill the organization around technology, around generative AI. What is it? What is AI? What are the different kinds? How are we using it in the business? How can you use it personally? So upskilling the organization so that people understand how to use the technology responsibly, but also as a learning function saying, well, how is this technology going to change the way that we design, deliver, deploy our learning? Doing a lot of pilots in various areas to see where we can use AI to deliver coaching, for example, leadership development programs. We now have an internal kind of LLM where we are able to now say, how can we teach people to be better prompt engineers so they can use our internal systems to develop themselves, if you will, understanding that the L&D function is going to change dramatically, is changing before our very eyes. So as we're upskilling others, also trying to upskill ourselves to determine, okay, how are we going to do this differently, more efficiently? How can we reach more people using some of these more evolved technologies?
Yeah. Where are you seeing the most success? What are
It's
you
a
most
good
excited about?
question. Yeah, I think anytime the first time, I used ChatGPT, I said, oh, wow, okay. First of all, this is as close to natural language processing as I had experienced in the many years since the dark ages where I was studying AI, but also realizing, okay, something is shifting. And so trying to help people understand what it is that's shifting. I've talked to a lot of folks who are in my industry and they are frozen. We don't know what to do. Well, just do something, experiment, try, jump in there and see how the technology works so that it's not happening to you, that you're able to use it to your benefit. And then, of course, working with legal and working with our friends across the organization to say, okay, how can we do this in a way that is protective of the enterprise? So I think we're seeing a lot of success trying to help people understand what these technologies are. And then something as simple as the various tasks that it takes to create a great learning program, whether it be administrative, whether it be content creation, whether it be marketing, and being able to use our various internal Gen AI tools to make those things go faster. I still am waiting to see really great simulations that are AI powered. I've seen a lot of demos of those, but I'm looking forward to seeing them in real time and being able to do more of that work as well.
Yeah. Um, and one of the things that I think a lot about is, I'm curious to get your thoughts. I think a big part of learning is getting people to care about learning and then actually put in effort, right? Like use your mental energy to stretch yourself. And the challenge with a lot of technology enabled solutions is that they don't create that environment. Like people sort of like the same way, like the Netflix of learning never quite really took off. And any sort of like sort of one-on-one solo interaction with an AI, there's a question of will people actually try it that hard, or do they see it as kind of one of these, sort of fake simulations? How do you think about the challenge of that, sort of cultivating real human effort and motivation to learn, versus making everything tech enabled?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the foundation of everything. I mean, learning culture is something I feel really passionate about. When I first joined, I realized the very first goal that I must have is to create some sort of learning passion within the folks who were at my organization, to create a campaign around owning your own learning and development, and really just encouraging people to learn every day and think of learning as a superpower, and to understand you could learn your way through anything, whether you have one paper manual or you have the best technology in the world. I think that there's a whole the focus on making sure people understand that learning is something that can be a tool that can really transform themselves, their lives, their organizations. I think that's where it comes in, that it's not really about the technology at that point. It's about thinking of yourself as a learner and
Yeah.
understanding that taking that journey from not knowing to knowing is worthwhile, and putting effort into that, because sometimes that journey is very difficult and it will challenge you. And I think, we talk about growth mindsets and fixed mindsets. All of that is still relevant, even in the age of new technology, is really believing that, what, I don't know this thing. And I know that there are tools and resources and ways that I can get to the point where I do. And it's worthwhile to actually figure out how to get to the point where I do know that thing. I think that's critical. And no matter what you do, if you don't instill that in the people who you're trying to inspire, then you're making it much more difficult for yourself than it should be.
Yeah. Great point. Curious if you have any specific example of a successful tech-enabled learning that has created the right motivation and impact for the learners and the business.
That's a really great question. I mean, I can take you back to the days where we're creating simulations where we really said, okay, well, let's talk to the subject matter experts at this organization, figure out what the common mistakes are. Let's figure out where people commonly have trouble grasping this particular kind of, whether a topic or function, et cetera, and really putting the energy into making sure that the technology or the simulations or the scenarios really mapped to that. I felt like we did some really great work there. I think anytime that you have a technology enabled solution that has great stories, that helps, because then the stories are able to bridge between what the learner may be experiencing and what an expert could help them to understand. I've seen a few kind of AI infused leadership um, programs where I felt like, wow, I really feel like I'm having a conversation with somebody and I'm getting really great advice. There's a lot of coaching solutions out there that I think have a lot of promise. So those are some examples. I think there's still so much we can do with the technology, and so it's exciting to see things kind of evolve and unfold.
Great. Um, uh, and what do you think are the biggest risks that people are not kind of maybe people are overlooking when it comes to using new technologies like AI right now in learning?
I mean, I think the biggest issue is you still have to be smart. You still have to ask great questions. You still have to have discernment. I mean, how many stories have you seen where somebody has used, an LLM, come up with some, verbiage, put it in a document, and it's just not true? Like whether it's a hallucination or it's something that is slightly not aligned with reality. I think even more so than ever, having those conversations about, no, you still have to ask really great questions. And when you get answers, you have to figure out if they sound like reality or they don't. I think that's where there's going to be much more mentoring and coaching necessary from those humans who have been in the game for a little bit longer to say, well, okay, that doesn't make any sense, or to try to help coach those who are using the technologies and thinking that they are somehow always right. Those critical thinking skills become even more important. And I think that's something that is easy to get lost, right, in the excitement of moving towards, kind of new ways to use these technologies, is to realize they're really great, but they're not
Mm.
perfect yet. And you still need to ask questions and ask good questions.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of, we have a lot of conversation with organizations that are just trying to level up their um, junior employees up all the way to like mid-level managers on just being more critical thinkers and like um, having refined professional, strategic business skills, right? In order to be able to use tools like AI with discernment, as you said.
Yeah.
I'm curious at Kraft Heinz how you're thinking about helping people really continue to hone their critical thinking such that AI doesn't become a crutch or actually the tool that depletes people's critical thinking.
Yeah. I mean, we call our, some people call them soft skills, we call them power skills. And critical thinking is just one of them, just in general, whether it's related to AI or not, to your point, becoming someone who has business acumen, someone who's thinking more broadly about or more deeply about things. I think one of the things that we do also do is, as we're having training sessions around our new kind of our internal LLM, to say, um, to just put some gotchas in there and say, could you, is this, you think this is true? Like, this is a question that we've asked our internal, we call them Kai, Kraft Heinz AI, is that, do you think this is true or not? And actually putting people in situations where they're able to see things and having to ask if they're true. I remember when I was designing business simulations, I like to have things that were right, wrong, and understandably wrong.
Yeah.
And that understandably wrong section is like, well, I mean, it could be right, but you have to use your context clues. You have to use your critical thinking to say, well, in this scenario or in this context, it's actually not correct. So providing more opportunities for people to interact with the shades of gray, and having conversations around those or giving feedback around that, just to give people a chance to practice being critical thinkers.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. Like, I think people build judgment and discernment through working through like a mediocre example, like a good example, a great example, things that look great on surface but actually are not that good, and they'll exercise their judgment and then see what would an expert might have done on that.
Yeah.
For you to be able to benchmark yourself, I think is a pretty important sort of experience for learning. So I think it
Yeah,
seems
I
like
think,
that.
you talk to an expert, they can do it pretty quickly. They can see something and say that's not
Yeah,
true or that's mediocre. And so being able to have that interaction between those who are experts and those who are just ramping up, so that even with the technology, you still have to have that kind of coaching, mentoring, feedback, so that everybody is like, leveling up their game, if you will.
yeah. From a skill or sort of domain perspective, beyond like teaching people AI, which is obviously seems like a big priority right now, where is the biggest demand from business to L&D teams and say, hi, I need your help on XYZ with our teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think people managers, AI or not, are that's the group that needs the most support, right? Because they have to deliver, they have to coach, mentor, develop. They're the ones who have to have the difficult conversations. And so I think a lot of that leadership development space, that the content around how do I deal with people, encouraging and inspiring them to deliver, but also developing them as humans and as professionals, that's a space where there's just a lot of need.
Mm.
right? And so whether it's, across functions, sometimes, we have 9 functional academies, and certainly there are asks for specific kind of technical development of skills, but across the board, it's, can you help our managers with their people manager skills, with their leadership development skills, with their ability to inspire and drive work through people.
And what have you seen most effective in this manager development? Yeah, what's your preferred approach to supporting them?
Yeah, I mean, we have lots of different programs. We have programs for new managers because that's one kind of professional step that is, memorable because it's all sometimes painful, where you go from being a peer to being a manager. Cohort-based programs are important because then you can learn from each other and have those who have been people managing for quite some time come back and share their best practices around some of the things that you can expect as a people manager. I think those are some. We have coaching of all kinds, whether it's by humans or through technology, to make sure people have the opportunity to ask questions at the point of need. So those are some examples of ways we support our people managers.
Cool. Um, One of the things that you said in your previous speech was you frame learning as a superpower. Um, I'd love for you to maybe elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that learning is a superpower. And just like we were speaking about before, when you think of yourself as a learner, then you realize that no matter what situation you're in, you'll be okay. Because if you focus your energy on learning whatever it is you need to be great in that situation, then you will find your way through. And whether that's reskilling or upskilling, or if your life is disrupted, your profession is disrupted, learning the ability to think of yourself as a learner is something that I think can make you feel invincible. And, a lot of times we spend time thinking about what skills people need to develop. But at the end of the day, in the world that we live in today, the most important skill is learning how to learn and learning how to be a learner, determining what you need to know in order to get through a specific situation. And so that's why I say learning is a superpower, because if you think of yourself as a learner, really there's no situation that will paralyze you to the point where you can't figure out how to move forward.
Yeah. And as someone in the learning sort of field, that of course that resonates a lot. Now I feel like a lot of learning leaders have a harder time convincing like business stakeholders and or even sometimes even the learners of the importance of prioritizing learning for organizational success or individual success. How have you navigated the challenge of getting people to buy into the importance of learning in the
Yeah.
organization?
I mean, I think I do a bit of kind of performance art, right? I'm a pretty visible learner, and when I stepped into my role as chief learning officer, I wanted to show people what it looked like to make time for learning, to learn something new every day for 365 days, whether that was for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or an entire day. And just being relentless with that, saying learning is something that's important, that you make time for learning. Of course, as I've moved through the organization and things have gotten even more unprecedented and more hectic, I understand even more so how difficult it is to make time for learning. And I'm also, talking to my team about how we can connect what we do more closely to business outcomes and how we can speak the language of the business. So if we're creating a program and we have 4 topics, how can we determine which one is connected to the P&L item that is most important? And so I see both sides, right? I think that a learning culture is so important, and teaching people to learn something new, anything, to just keep taking in information is important. But I'm not immune to wanting to make sure that my my learners understand that I know they don't have that much time, and they want to be clear on, like, well, what do I need to learn to be great in this role or in this task or at this point in the business cycle, and that business leaders are concerned about the business outcome. So holding both in 2 hands, but not ever letting go of the learning culture piece, because I think that if you lose sight of just helping people think of themselves as learners, it's so much more difficult to do the rest of the work, and you're doing your learners a disservice, because at some point they have to just continue learning at the speed at which change is happening, which is getting faster and faster and faster than our ability to create specific programs about specific topics or functions or um, skills, capabilities, whatever you want to call them.
Let's maybe dive a little bit into the learning culture piece. It seems like a pretty hard thing to build. Also a bit abstract, right, as a concept. Like now, I think you shared a really strong lever, which is to role model yourself, but only so many people get to observe you directly. That doesn't actually permeate through an organization that's as big as Kraft Heinz, let's say. So how do you think about the levers that actually help organizations become a learning oriented culture?
Yeah. I mean, certainly you're right. Everyone doesn't know who I am or doesn't see me. But if you create kind of an army of learners and send them across the organization, then that's helpful. You have ambassadors for learning. We have programs that are both nomination based and application based, bringing people into those programs, helping them understand this is all part of the learning culture as well as whatever the topic is that we're covering and sending them back in the organization. The top of the house from the CEO on down, sharing what books they're reading or sharing what podcasts they're listening to or what they're grappling with, and really just inspiring people to talk about what they're learning and share what they're learning. So it is, it starts from the top, it starts from the bottom, but it just like any kind of cultural elements, you just have to be relentless. And even as you are focusing on specific capabilities that drive strategy or drive your outcomes, to always remind the organization we are a learning organization, and that's important. And so that's something I've committed to. I think if you ask most people at Kraft Heinz, they'll know that I'm a learner. And I'll just keep talking about that because I think that's important.
Yeah. Sounds like from what you're highlighting, it really comes down actually to both you role modeling, but also having more role models
Yes,
embedded
absolutely.
closer to the people, and them like evangelizing learning.
Absolutely.
Um, uh, have you had experience sort of being in an organization that actually has a deeply embedded learning culture? And what did that look like?
Yeah. I mean, aside from the one that I currently am in, I come
Mm,
from consulting, and I feel like in consulting, there's high expectations for kind of what you are expected to know and learn at
mm,
different area, different levels of of your career from day one. At least that was my experience, and so I think that's my one of my frames of reference in terms of a culture that just expects you to be a continual learner. I mean, I worked for myself for 13 years, so I think that's also a culture that was extremely like learning focused, because
yeah.
when you work for yourself, you have to stay kind of up to date on all the things. Um, but I think I mean, that's that consulting foundation, and then really wanting to make an impact when I started as a chief learning officer and be visible as the learner, and knowing that that would help everything else that I had to do going forward.
Mm. One of the things I hear a lot about when I talk to learning leaders inside our organization is they're grappling. I mean, there are a lot of things they're grappling with. One of them, I think, is, oh, our learners are really time poor, and um, how do I help them engage in learning when it often falls down the list of priorities of things they have to do every day? Um, how do you handle those kind of challenges?
Yeah. So, as part of my 365 days of learning, I had two hashtags. One was learn like an owner, which was all around the ownership of learning and development. And one was make time for learning. And that was just to address exactly what you said, that people don't have time. And started sharing situations or sharing examples of how if I just had one phrase and a search engine, I could find an article that could help me for 15 minutes go down a rabbit hole where I could get some new ideas and get some inspiration. I love, HBR is one of my favorites. I went through the entire LinkedIn learning library, again, trying to say, here are ways that you can learn that don't take 6 hours, 8 hours, a week, traveling to a business school somewhere in order to get some information. And I mean, I guess I'm a little bit of a broken record, but I think it is being able to model to others what it looks like to continue learning when you only have 5 minutes, right? whenever I send out kind of links, if I'm sending out saying, here's something I always say like it's 2 minutes long, it's 5 minutes long, so that people understand, before you file it away in your, to read later folder, that it really will only take you 2 minutes to get an infusion of new ideas. Everybody is time poor. I don't know who has enough time. I certainly don't. But in being a learning evangelist, trying to help people understand, okay, this is what you can do if you only have 4 minutes, or this is what you can do if you only have 10 minutes.
Mm. And, there are people talk about importance of, there are different types of learning, right? There's some formal learning programs. There are also like informal, like a lot of the things you just discussed were like more informal learning, where you might be watching something for 5 minutes and things like that. When do you think formal learning programs are still important, and why?
I mean, certainly formal learning is important when you need to go deep on a topic, or you want to develop a certain amount of kind of expertise, right, around something. I certainly valued my time at university and grad school. I couldn't have done that in 10-minute increments. I shouldn't say I couldn't have. I'm sure I could have learned a lot of things, but being in kind of a community of learners and doing focused learning around a topic is valuable. And so it's just a matter of determining what it is you need that looks like that, and when you can make time for that. And people all over generations have found ways to make time for that. We do still have leadership development programs where we pull executives out of their day to day for a week and move them into another kind of learning space. There's value in being somewhere other than your day to day in order to learn. So I think it's not an or, it's an and.
Mm. This is great. So the one last question, Pamay, what is a maybe surprising or less talked about insight about succeeding as an L&D leader you could share with other people who are either a senior person in the learning function or wanting to get into that role?
Well, I mean, I think humility is helpful. And I say that because, I have lots of things that I've learned from my year of learning. And one of those things is sometimes learning is just hard. You got to buckle your seatbelt. Sometimes it feels awful to not know something, and you really want to already know it, and you really want to be an expert at it, and you don't. And so being able to be humble enough to say, okay, I realize I'm just at the beginning of a learning journey, and I'm going to just be courageous and take one step after another. And as a learning leader, understanding that that's the experience that your learners are having is very helpful, right? Because it's not about just kind of brute force shoving learning into someone's brain. Learning is sometimes very hard, and it's sometimes humbling when you want to know something already, you don't already know it. And I think maybe we don't talk about that part of learning as much as we should. We're maybe focused on what are the activities, what are the resources. But I think being empathetic to the fact that the learning process is sometimes challenging, I think could be very helpful as a learning leader, because then you are able to step into the shoes of your learner and help them along their journey.
Yeah, that ties really nicely to what you said, which was you're very learner centric, and if you're not open to learning, you're not going to learn. Like no matter how great your learning
Right.
experience is, if the person just doesn't want to learn, like you can't do much about it. And so to your point, like creating like being empathetic allows you to connect with them in a way they're actually willing and excited to sort of take in the information, and then you're going to be much more effective.
I agree.
Well, thanks for joining. This was great. And, I'm looking forward to just getting to know you more and building relationship beyond this podcast. So really appreciate you sharing your insights today.
Thank you so much. This has been a really great
Great.
conversation. I appreciate your time.